November 17th, 1941. Hitokapu Bay, in the Kurule Islands. The water lies dark and metallic beneath a low ceiling of winter cloud. Spray crystallizes on rails and rigging. Steel decks ring under hurried boots, then fall quiet again, as if the fleet itself has decided to hold its breath. In the anchorages and narrow passages, the carriers and their escorts sit close. Too close for comfort, close enough for signal lamps to pass messages like whispered prayers across the black. Down in radio rooms, home transmitters are rendered helpless by deliberate hands. Contacts insulated, circuits broken, keys made useless. The most powerful striking arm Japan has ever assembled is ordered to travel mute, an empire moving eastward by silence alone. That moment matters because it reveals an anxiety that predated the bombs at Pearl Harbor, not fear of American guns, but fear of American ears. For decades, navies had treated the sea as a curtain, vast, indifferent hiding ships with distance and weather. Yet by 1941, the ocean was beginning to betray a new weakness. It was no longer only the wake that could be seen, or the mast that could be spotted at dawn. It was the invisible thread of radio, thin as a spider's strand, but strong enough to pull a fleet into view if an enemy knew how to grasp it. In the weeks before the Pacific War, Japan's planners gambled that discipline, deception, and radio silence could keep the curtain closed. And at first, they succeeded spectacularly. Yes, the expectation within the Imperial Japanese Navy was ancient in spirit, that mastery meant command of concealment. A fleet that transmitted little would remain a rumor. A fleet that transmitted nothing could become a ghost. Yamamoto's offensive vision, striking Pearl Harbor first, demanded that ghostliness. It demanded a force concentrated, trained, fueled, and moved thousands of miles without betraying itself to the radio intelligence nets that ringed the Pacific. Should Japanese commanders expected that if they could simply deny the enemy the raw material of interception, call signs, message headings, the familiar fist of a radio man tapping Morse, then American admirals would remain trapped inside their own assumptions. And assumption in intelligence work can be more binding than iron. But the war would teach a harsher truth. Radio silence was not merely a discipline. It was an admission, an unspoken confession that the enemy's direction finders were feared. Japanese commanders did not invent that fear at Hitokapu Bay. It had already been proven to them in the months before Pearl Harbor in a smaller episode that carried a larger omen. In mid-1941, when Japanese carriers moved south toward Formosa during operations connected to French Indochina, a British intercept and direction-finding site at Hong Kong listened and located them. A Japanese radio intelligence team aboard Soryu intercepted the British direction-finding message itself, and a Japanese officer later summarized the lesson with chilling clarity. The British could not read the codes, but they could plot and follow ship movement. The ocean had begun to speak in bearings. From that point, Japanese planners treated Allied radio intelligence as a predator that did not need to understand language. It only needed to understand geometry. Three methods, Japanese and American alike knew, formed the skeleton of radio intelligence: direction finding, traffic analysis, OI, and cryptanalysis. Even without breaking a cipher, call signs and patterns could sketch a moving map. Bearings could turn that sketch into a location, and if the cipher fell, the map would gain captions and intent. Japanese commanders expected, hoped, that the Americans were still trapped in the first two, and still imperfectly equipped there. In late 1941, that hope was not irrational. American capabilities existed, but they were uneven, stretched by distance, and vulnerable to deception. And in Hawaii and the Philippines, U.S. Navy radio intelligence stations listened constantly. They listened not only for content, but for identity. The distinctive rhythm of an operator's keying, the externals of messages, the small habits that machines could not disguise. Yet their direction-finding net across the mid-Pacific was limited. Joseph Rochefort, chief of station HIPO in Hawaii, would later describe how that net was not as efficient or productive of results as it might have been, lacking equipment and trained operators, and burdened by long distances that made good fixes difficult. In other words, the Americans could often hear Japan, but could not always pin it down with certainty. That uncertainty was exactly where Japanese deception aimed its blade. So Japan did more than fall silent. It performed an illusion. As the Kido Butai buttoned up, Japanese planners seeded the air with ghost transmissions, carrier call signs and procedural chatter sent not from the moving fleet, but from operators left ashore at the great naval bases, Sasebo, Kure, Yokosuka. The deception exploited a subtle human fingerprint, the fist, the unique cadence of Morse, which could convince a listener that the same ship, the same man, the same steel hull remained in home waters. His American monitoring stations used direction-finding gear to take bearings on those call signs. The lines crossed over Japanese bases, exactly where American analysts already expected the carriers to be. The deception did not need to prove the carriers were in port. It only needed to keep American intelligence from suspecting they were not. In the American radio rooms, thus the war in 1941 was often fought as a patient struggle against emptiness, a page of bearings and calls that said more by what it did not contain. Nothing on the carriers, some summaries noted, an absence that, in retrospect, should have screamed. But Admiral Kimmel had seen such absences before. Radio silence was not unheard of, and uncertainty became routine. Japan exploited that routine until it became blindness. After the attack, Sir Rochefort, asked when he finally again heard from the Japanese carriers, answered with the grim simplicity of a man who had spent years chasing signals through static. The 7th of December. Yet this is where the story turns, because the very success of Japanese deception at Pearl Harbor helped set the stage for the shock Japanese commanders would later feel. They had proven to themselves that radio discipline and clever masking could defeat American radio intelligence. Yet they had made the enemy misplace a fleet. They had watched the largest operation in their Navy's history sail unseen to its launch point. It was tempting, fatally tempting, to believe this was a permanent condition, that the Americans might be industrious, but were also predictable, that they relied on crude habits, that their ears could be fooled with theater. And then the war unfolded, and theater began to fail. It failed not because radios changed, but because America changed what it did with the faintest whisper of radio energy. What Japanese commanders encountered was not simply a piece of equipment. It was a system, an industrial habit turned into military method. It stretched from shore stations to ships, from analysts to operators, from mathematics to manufacturing. It turned every transmission into a potential confession, not always of content, but of existence, presence, direction, and pattern. Even a brief burst could be captured, yet compared and plotted. In the Atlantic, Allied sailors gave high-frequency direction, finding a nickname that sounded almost playful, Huff-Duff. But the playfulness hid its brutality. As one wartime technical account described it, earlier direction finding had been slow and required careful loop adjustments. Submarines could evade it by keeping messages short, and Huff-Duff changed the rhythm of that duel by making direction. Finding instantaneous, able to determine a transmitter's direction with a single dot of code. Whether applied against a U-boat in the Atlantic or a transmitter across the Pacific, the principle was the same. The enemy no longer needed you to speak for long. He only needed you to speak at all. This was the emotional contrast that haunted Japanese commanders as the conflict deepened. Yet the men who planned Pearl Harbor expected radio to remain a tool, useful, dangerous, but controllable through doctrine and obedience. They expected the ocean's distance to amplify their secrecy. Instead, they discovered distance could serve the listener as well as the speaker, because distance allowed multiple stations, separated by thousands of miles, to take bearings on the same signal and turn that geometry into a trap. When radio direction finding was paired with traffic analysis, some of the trap grew even tighter. Patterns of who called whom, when, and with what urgency could betray a fleet's posture without revealing a single word of the message. There is a peculiar cruelty in that kind of intelligence. It does not require the grand victory of breaking the enemy's cipher. It does not need to understand ideology or poetry or orders. It merely counts and measures. It listens the way a storm listens, by pressure changes rather than meaning. Japanese commanders, trained in a tradition that prized decisive battle and visible strength, faced an enemy that could sometimes find them without seeing them, could sometimes anticipate without reading, could sometimes close distance guided by nothing more than a line on a chart labeled with a bearing. And in those American rooms where charts were marked and pins were placed, another contrast lived quietly: abundance. The recurring object was simple, almost embarrassing in its ordinary nature. A tin mug of coffee, it refilled without ceremony, sitting beside a receiver warm with vacuum tube heat. Coffee in the American military was not merely a drink, it was a permission slip for endurance, a symbol that the industrial homeland could afford wakefulness. While fleets maneuvered and men died somewhere behind the front, coffee was shipped in bulk, brewed in endless cycles, consumed in radio shacks and operations rooms where the war was measured in minutes and kilocycles. The mug returned again and again, is as constant as the hiss of static, an emblem of a democracy's ability to keep thousands of anonymous specialists awake, fed, and supplied long enough to make listening a weapon. Visual reference for wartime direction-finding apparatus and stations: World War II Radio Direction Finders, Western Historic Radio Museum, High-Frequency Direction-Finding Image, Wikipedia. Japan also listened, and this is crucial to the transformation in perception. Japanese radio intelligence was not naive. Before Pearl Harbor, Japanese stations monitored American communications, studied call signs, and used direction finding to learn about American aircraft routes and patrol patterns around Hawaii. Japanese planners noted that reconnaissance flights were almost exclusively to the west and south. The northern approach remained uncovered, a gap that became the path of the Kido Butai. Even Admiral Kimmel's staff recognized the spike in Japanese direction-finding activity in late 1941. One assessment warned that Japanese DF was getting results. In other words, Japan understood the value of the invisible war, and Japan practiced it. But what Japan underestimated was not the concept. It was scale. The American advantage that grew across the war was the democratic industrial habit of turning a concept into a network. It was one thing to have a direction finder. It was another to have many. It was one thing to monitor. It was another to fuse monitoring with analysis, and analysis with operations, and operations with manufacturing that could replace losses and expand reach. The same American system that produced carriers, aircraft, and fuel also produced the quieter infrastructure of signals: receivers, antennas, trained operators, standardized reporting, routines that made the invisible visible. Japanese commanders had expected American abundance to express itself only in ships and planes, gross tonnage, raw output, and they did not fully anticipate how abundance could also be intellectual and procedural. More radios, more intercept posts, more plotting tables, more coffee-fed night shifts, more redundancy. The American ability to put more into a problem did not always guarantee brilliance, but it often guaranteed persistence. And persistence is what direction finding rewards. This is why the symbolism of the coffee mug matters. It is not romantic. It is not heroic in the traditional sense. It is instead profoundly political. A totalitarian system can order silence, enforce deception, punish mistakes. But sustaining a continent-spanning listening effort, day after day, month after month, requires a different kind of power, logistical patience, bureaucratic continuity, and a workforce broad enough that thousands can labor in anonymity without the entire system collapsing into exhaustion. Coffee is a small material sign of that larger reality, a nation able to nourish the unglamorous, a repetitive work that makes sudden moments of tactical clarity possible. Even within Japan's own Pearl Harbor plan, we see how keenly they feared that kind of listening. The Kido Butai's radio silence was not casual. It was engineered down to the hardware. Paper inserted between key contacts, fuses removed, transmitters disabled. One ship's communications officer kept a transmitter key boxed up, used as a pillow, so that the power to speak could not be used impulsively. The day before the attack, after nearly 20 days of imposed silence, Japanese radiomen tested transmitters on dummy loads and found some had become unreliable from residue or corrosion. An almost tragic detail, showing how complete the denial had been. This was a fleet that treated a single unauthorized emission as a flare fired into darkness. And yet, the war's transformation lay in the realization that perfect silence is rarely sustainable, especially for a modern navy fighting across an ocean. His silence can conceal movement, but it can also paralyze coordination. Japanese doctrine contained mechanisms for one-way broadcast communications, messages transmitted from shore, copied by ships, with no acknowledgement required. The striking force relied on that method as it sailed east, and then relayed received orders through semaphore and signal lamps across tight formations. This preserved silence, but at the cost of rigidity. Fleets must cluster to share light. Yet they must keep formation to share flags. They must accept delays to preserve invisibility. In peacetime planning, that trade may seem acceptable. In wartime chaos, it becomes a chain. Japanese commanders also made a security decision that reveals how deeply they feared radio betrayal. Commander Minoru Genda argued against sending air reconnaissance ahead of the force because lost pilots might request navigational help by radio, broadcasting their presence into the ether and alerting the Americans. That argument prevailed. The carriers would not scout ahead in the usual way. It is a haunting inversion of naval tradition. Eyes were withheld because mouths might speak, and the fleet chose blindness to preserve silence. This is where what they expected and what they experienced collide most sharply. Japanese commanders expected American radio intelligence to be something like a lock, difficult, mechanical, occasionally effective, but defeatable through keys and tricks. They experienced it more like weather, not always predictable, sometimes mistaken, but capable of sudden, devastating clarity when conditions aligned. For Americans, jet direction finding and traffic analysis were not mystical arts. They were work. They required disciplined operators and careful systems that could be imperfect, as Rochefort admitted. But imperfection did not mean irrelevance. Even a weak DF net could become decisive when paired with other information, when repeated over time, when integrated into command estimates. And as the war progressed, American learning accelerated. The techniques that had been strained and uncertain in 1941 could become sharper through experience, equipment, and doctrinal adaptation, exactly the kind of incremental improvement that an industrial democracy excels at when given time. Japanese commanders, meanwhile, faced a corrosive psychological shift. In the early war, success encouraged faith in concealment. Pearl Harbor, the swift advances, the sense that American forces were surprised and clumsy, but repeated losses, ships found, ambushed, struck when secrecy seemed intact, bred suspicion. When men believe the sea hides them and then discover it does not, they begin to look inward for betrayal. Careless radiomen, flawed procedures, lax discipline. Sometimes the problem really is discipline. But sometimes the problem is that the enemy has changed the nature of the environment. The sea did not become smaller, it became more measurable. And measurement is a form of power. Direction finding does not care about courage. Yet a transmission made by a brave man and a transmission made by a frightened one look the same to an antenna. The ether is democratic in its own cruel way. It treats all emissions as equal, all as traceable, all as potential lines converging on a point. In that sense, radio direction finding became a strange mirror of America's own ideological claim. Democracy, at least in aspiration, insists that no voice is inherently privileged. The airwaves, once weaponized by science and industry, and echoed that logic. Any voice could be heard, and therefore any voice could betray. This transformation in perception touched ideology as well as tactics. The Japanese naval worldview had long emphasized decisive battle, concentrated honor, a culminating clash that would resolve the conflict through visible destruction. Yet the war's hidden dimension suggested something unsettling. Victory might belong not only to those who fought best at the moment of contact, but to those who structured contact itself, who chose when and where it would occur by shaping information. That is not merely a technical lesson. It is an ideological one because it implies that systems, bureaucracies, networks, production lines, training pipelines can outweigh individual brilliance, and systems, unlike heroes, are nourished by abundance. The coffee mug returns here again because it embodies that abundance without needing to declare it. As it sits beside a receiver as a quiet proof that the United States could afford to keep listening, not just for an hour, not just for a crisis, but for years. Listening became routine, and routine became advantage. In Japanese planning culture, secrecy was often treated as a peak achievement, something attained through heightened discipline at decisive moments. In the American model, secrecy's opponent, surveillance, could be normalized. It could be turned into shift work. Yet the moral weight of that difference is immense. One side strains toward silence. The other side, with supplies and manpower and procedural confidence, simply keeps the watch. When Japanese commanders couldn't believe the reach of American direction finders, the disbelief was not only about instruments. It was about what those instruments implied, that American democracy, often caricatured by its enemies as soft or chaotic, could organize quiet competence at enormous scale. That it could turn the most ordinary human needs, sleep, warmth, caffeine, into a strategic asset by meeting them reliably. That the anonymous labor of technicians and operators, people far from the glamour of a flight deck, could shape outcomes as surely as bombs. This is not to claim American intelligence was omniscient. Even at Pearl Harbor, Japan proved that deception and silence could work, that assumptions could be manipulated, yet that direction finding could be fed false bearings and false confidence. American radio intelligence before December 1941, as Hanyuk's research shows, could be starved of traffic and misled by carefully staged transmissions. Japan's planners synchronized silence, deception, and monitoring to ensure the Pacific Fleet remained unaware of the approaching Kido Butai. They succeeded, and the measure of that success was catastrophe in Hawaii. Yes, but the epilogue of that success was not Japanese security. It was American adaptation. The United States did what it would do again and again across the war. It absorbed surprise, then expanded the machinery of response until the enemy's earlier advantages became liabilities. Techniques like HF/DF, methods like traffic analysis, and the broader discipline of communications intelligence were refined, extended, and integrated into operations. Yes, the invisible war did not replace carriers and aircraft. It guided them. It gave shape to the ocean's emptiness. It allowed American power, industrial, naval, and ideological, to strike with a sense of inevitability that could feel supernatural to those on the receiving end. And so we return, in the mind's eye, to that winter bay in the Kuriles, Hitokapu Bay, where a fleet sat silent and believed silence could make it untouchable. The ice wind still cuts across the water. Signal lamps still blink in disciplined restraint. The radios still wait, deliberately crippled like weapons locked away from their own owners. In that moment, Japanese commanders were not foolish. They were intelligent men responding to a real threat. They understood that transmissions could be hunted. They understood that an enemy might not need to read a message to exploit it. They understood enough to choose blindness over a pilot's desperate call for bearings. But they did not yet understand the larger truth that the war would carve into steel and memory, that the modern battlefield is not only a contest of will, but a contest of systems, that the sound of democracy, messy in politics, loud in debate, can become, in wartime, a quieter sound, the steady hum of machines in distant huts, the scratch of pencil on plotting paper, the soft clink of a coffee mug set down beside a warm receiver as another shift begins. Oh, freedom and abundance do not always look like speeches or flags. Sometimes they look like endurance. Sometimes they sound like static. And sometimes, somewhere over the Pacific, they take the form of a single dot of Morse, tiny, brief, and fatal, because a network of listeners, sustained by a nation that can afford to keep them awake, is waiting to turn that dot into a line, and that line into a crossing point on a chart. In the end, yes, the revelation was not that American direction finders could track every transmission. The revelation was what that tracking represented: a society capable of feeding, staffing, and sustaining the invisible labor that makes power precise. Empires can command silence. Democracies can fund the patience to listen. And between those two truths, between the forced quiet of a fleet and the endless vigilance of a network, the 20th century's struggle over ideology found one of its most understated, its most decisive battlegrounds.